Okay, let's start activity 7-2, representing a percentage problem with an equation. All right, there's 3 parts to this activity, and then within each of the parts, there are some individual problems as well. So let's start with part 1. Answer each question and show your reasoning. Is 60% of 400 equal to 87? So, what I could do to solve this is just find what 60% of 400 is and then check and see is it equal to 87. So I'm going to start doing that. 60%, I know I can write that as 60 hundredths of is multiplication and then 200. So I want to find 60 hundredths times 200. I can write my 200 as an improper fraction. And then before I multiply across, because if I just multiply top times top over bottom times bottom, I'm going to end up with some really big numbers that I'm going to have to then simplify. It's easier to simplify before I multiply. So I look for a common factor in both the numerator and denominator, and it could be the same number, or it could be one from one and one from the other, which is what I'm going to do. Because 100 and 200 are it's easy to see they both have a common factor of 100. So if I divide them both by 100, I get 2 and 1. And now I can multiply straight across. 60 times 2 is, oops, I started with the wrong problem. That's okay. 60 times 2 is 120 over 1 times 1 is 1. So 60% of 200 is equal to 120, and 120 is most definitely not equal to 87. So I'm going to say no. All right, now let's go back and do part A. So it's very similar. 60% of 400, so 60 hundredths times 400. And again, if I write 400 as an improper fraction, and I can see I could simplify once again by dividing this denominator and this numerator by 100. So 400 divided by 100 is 4, 100 divided by 100 is 1, and now I've got 4 times 60. 4 times 6 is 24, so 4 times 60 is 240 over 1 times 1, so it's just 240. And 240 also is not equal to 87, so that's a no as well. I just wanted to point out some alternate methods for doing this calculation. We talked about when we were working on the percentages unit. Another way I could do this is if my percent is a multiple of 10, one thing I could do is actually just find 10% of a number. So instead of finding 60% of 400, I could have found 10% of 400. That's easy to do. You just move the decimal point one place to the left. So 10% would have been 40. So 60% would have been 6 times that amount, and 6 times 40 is 240. So that was just, another way you could do this, and you can kind of do it mentally that way. It works here as well. 10% of 200 would be 20, so 6 times 20 is 120. Also, I could notice the relationship between these two problems. Here I'm finding 60% of 400. Here I'm finding 60% of 200, which is half that amount. So my answer, 120, is half the amount of the answer in part A. Okay, so just noting that there's multiple ways you can do that. So my last one is 60% of 120 equal to 87. So let's just try that idea. 10% of 120 would be 12. So 60% of 120 is going to be equal to 6 times that amount, which is equal to 72. And 72 still is not equal to 87. Okay. So that's that. All right. So we found that none of these were equal to 87. So part 2 of this problem says 60% of x is equal to 87. So 60% of 400, 200, and 120 were not equal to 87, but 60% of some number is equal to 87. We're going to call that number x. And we're being asked to write an equation that expresses a relationship between 60% x and 87. Solve your equation. So up here we saw, if we multiplied the number by 60% and found what it equaled, and in this case, we're not given the number that's being called x, and we want it to be equal to 87. So we can kind of use these as a guide for how we would write this equation. 60%, and I'll go ahead and write it as 60 hundredths, times x, and I don't need to use this multiplication symbol there because if I've got a number next to a variable, I know it means they're being multiplied together. And whatever x is, I know that 60% of it has to be equal to 87. So this is what our equation is going to look like. And I know how to solve these equations. I know we've been solving equations that look like this. I want to know what just x is, not what 60% of x is. So I need to get x all by itself. It's being multiplied by 60 hundredths, so I know I need to divide by 60 hundredths. Then in order to keep this equation true and balanced, I have to multiply whatever's on the other side of the equation by 60 hundredths as well. So 60 hundredths divided by 60 hundredths is 1. So that just leaves x, 1x on the left side. But on the right side, I've got 87 divided by 60 hundredths that I have to contend with. So first I'm going to write it out horizontally, 87 divided by 60 hundredths. And I know instead of dividing by a fraction, I can multiply by its reciprocal. So I'm going to rewrite that as 87 times 100 over 60. Now I'm going to end up with a big number here. So I want to see if I can do some simplifying first. And this jumps right out at me. 160 can both be divided by 20. So 100 divided by 20 is 5. And 60 divided by 20 is 3. So that simplifies it down quite a bit. I could do 87 times 5 over 1 times 3. But then I wonder, is 87 divisible by 3? Could I simplify this as well? If you remember the trick, if you add the digits in a number and it can be divided by 3, then that number can be divided by 3. 8 plus 7 is 15. 15 can be divided by 3, so I know 87 can be divided by 3. So I'm just going to come over here and do that. 87, because this isn't in my realm of math facts. 3 goes into 8 2 times. 2 times 3 is 6. Subtract, get a 2. Bring down the 7. 3 goes into 27 9 times. Exactly, so no remainder. So now I know 3 divided by 3 is 1. 87 divided by 3 is 29. Now I can't simplify this any further. I'm left with 5 times 29 over 1. I know 5 times 20 is 100 and 5 times 9 is 45. So I know 5 times 29 is 145 and 1 times 1 is 1. So there's my answer. X equals 145. Okay, so moving on to part 3. Write an equation to help you find the value of each variable. Solve the equation. 60% of C is 43.2. Now, if I were going to write this modeled on what I have kind of discovered in the previous parts of this problem, I know I could write it as 60 hundredths times C equals 43.2. But I have a decimal number here, and then I would be writing 60% as a fraction. And it's kind of awkward to work with two different representations in the same problem. So what I would like to do instead of using 60 hundredths is I would like to convert this to a decimal. So I know 60% is 60 hundredths. And if I simplify 60 hundredths, I could divide the top and bottom by 10. I get 6 tenths. And then I could write 6 tenths as a decimal. 0.6. So this is what I'm going to use instead of 60 hundredths. So I'm going to write 0.6 times C is equal to 43.2. And that just looks a little more workable. So I want to know what 1C is. So I want to divide by 6/10 on the left, and then I must also divide by 6/10 on the right. So on the left, 6/10 divided by 6/10 is 1, so I have C. And on the right, I have 43.2 divided by 6/10. So I'm going to do this as a long division problem, but I prefer to not have decimals in my problem, so I'm going to multiply the top and bottom by 10. I can do that because that keeps it as an equivalent expression. So my long division problem is going to look like 432 divided by 6. 6 won't go into 4, it goes into 43 7 times. 7 times 6 is 42. Subtract. Get 1, bring down my 2. Nice and neat. 6 goes into 12 twice. And no remainder. So C is equal to 72. So not as terrible as it looked. Now, I have B. 38% of E is equal to 190. So I can do this a couple ways. I could do 38 hundredths times E equals to 190. I could write my 38% just like I did in the last problem. I could rewrite it as a decimal instead of a fraction. Let's just leave it as a fraction. Let's use blue so it stays separate. So my problem, 38%, 38 hundredths times E equals 190. I'm going to divide both sides by 38 hundredths. So 38 hundredths divided by 38 hundredths just leaves 1E. And on the right side, I have 190 divided by 38 hundredths. So if I were to write that out horizontally, it's going to look like 190 divided by 38, not 380, 38 hundredths. So down here, I'm going to go ahead and do the keep, change, flip. This is going to be 190 times 100 over 38. I could do some simplifying. I could start actually with just the 138. If I divide both of these by 2, because they're even numbers, 100 divided by 2 is 50. And 38 divided by 2 is 19. And that worked out nicely because now I can see 190 and 19 can both be divided by 19. So 19 divided by 19 is 1, and 190 divided by 19 is 10. And I can't simplify any further because I've got 1s as denominators in both of those numbers. So 10 times 50 is 500 over 1. So I end up with E equals 500. I didn't leave a lot of space here. And there's my solution. Okay.